So if you step outside your door in, Amsterdam or London or New York or really any major city today, you immediately see this reality that just looks relentlessly full.
Right. Absolutely packed.
I mean, the streets are gridlocked, the subways are just shoulder to shoulder, and I mean, if you've tried to rent an apartment recently, the housing market feels like this brutal competition for just, an ever-shrinking amount of space.
Yeah, it's impossible.
It is, and we're constantly inundated with these headlines about rapid urbanization, right? Like the global population just keeps ticking upward. You look around, and literally every visual cue tells you humanity is just expanding.
Well, yeah, that's what your eyes tell you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But hidden right beneath the surface of all that crowded concrete, completely invisible to the naked eye, is this massive, silent, mathematical baby crisis.
It really is, it's the ultimate demographic paradox, I think, because we're simultaneously experiencing this really intense kind of claustrophobic feeling of urban density, but quietly charting a course toward this unprecedented societal shrinkage. Like, you sit in traffic and you think, well, the world is overflowing. But the underlying arithmetic of the native populations in these countries tells a completely different, almost contradictory story.
And unpacking that contradiction is basically what we're doing today. We are taking a deep dive into this really extensive source material, which is an interview with Jan Latten.
Right, the former chief demographer for Statistics Netherlands.
Yeah, the CBS. And what makes Latten's analysis so fascinating is that he doesn't just crunch birth rates in a vacuum. He's a pioneer in this really specialized field called social demography.
Which is a really vital distinction to make right at the start.
How so? Like, what's the difference?
Well, standard demography is essentially just a giant accounting exercise, right? It just counts the raw numbers. So it tells the government, okay, how many 20-year-olds exist in this specific area, how many deaths were recorded, how many birth certificates were issued.
Right, it's just a spreadsheet.
Exactly. It's binary, it's cold, it's purely quantitative. But social demography goes a layer deeper. It takes those raw numbers and asks, what do these people actually believe?
Oh, interesting.
Right, like how do they construct their daily lives? What are their foundational cultural values? And ultimately, how are those specific values going to reshape the physical and political society you live in?
I love that.
Yeah, it basically marries the hard math of population replacement with the incredibly messy, unpredictable reality of, well, human culture.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I want to start with the hardest math first. Latten's data on this hidden collapse of the native population is just staggering when you actually trace the mechanics of it.
It really is.
To really grasp it, you have to kind of look at the generational timeline, starting back in, the post-war era.
Right. So if you look at the 1950s, which was obviously the peak of the baby boom, the demographic math was straightforward and, well, highly expansive.
Give me the baseline numbers there.
So in that era, if you took a cohort of 100 women in a country like the Netherlands, on average, they were producing about 140 daughters over their lifetimes.
Okay, wait, so just daughters.
Right. Demographers often focus on daughters because they're the future mothers, right? They dictate the future reproductive capacity.
Got it. Okay, so you have a baseline of 100 women, and they give birth to 140 girls who eventually age up to become mothers themselves.
Exactly. And that isn't just a population replacing itself. That is the biological engine of a rapidly growing society.
I mean, that's why you can build new schools, right? And expand industries and comfortably fund pensions, because you constantly have this massive incoming workforce.
Yes, exactly. But then this massive structural shift occurs, and the data pinpoints the pivotal change right around 1964 and 1965.
The pill.
The pill, yes. It aligns with the widespread introduction of the birth control pill, but it also reflects this huge cultural shift regarding female autonomy, education, and family planning. So the birth rate doesn't just dip. It literally falls off a cliff.
Wow.
If you fast forward to the modern era, that same cohort of 100 women is no longer producing 140 daughters. They are producing roughly 70 daughters.
70. So from 140 down to 70.
Yes.
Which means the society is operating way below the replacement level. If 100 women have 100 daughters, the population graph is just a flat line.
Right. That's stability.
But 100 women having 70 daughters, that's where the math gets genuinely alarming because of this concept demographers refer to as the echo effect, right?
Yeah, the echo effect. You can kind of think of it as compounding interest, but working in reverse.
Oof. Compounding demographic debt.
Precisely. those 70 daughters grow up, and if they maintain the exact same birth rate as their mothers, meaning they also reproduce at a rate of 70%, they will only produce 49 daughters. Yeah. So in the span of just 2 generations, you've plummeted from a baseline of 100 potential mothers all the way down to 49.
That is insane.
Give it a few more generations at that rate, and the native population effectively halves itself.
This brings us right back to that visual illusion we started with, though. Like, why don't you notice this when you're just walking down a bustling city street?
Right, because you see people everywhere.
Exactly. If the population is halving itself, why does the cafe on my corner still have a line out the door every morning?
Well, Jan Latten argues that our aging population creates this incredibly powerful optical illusion. You don't see the missing babies because the grandmothers and the mothers are still very much alive.
Right. I mean, people live a lot longer now.
Exactly. They're occupying housing, they're participating in the consumer economy, they're driving cars. The sheer longevity of the older generations masks the shrinkage. But the demographic momentum, the mathematical certainty that the bottom is falling out of that population pyramid is already locked in.
The momentum is baked into the cake at this point. But, while the pill might have initiated this trend back in the 60s, Latten's analysis dives really deep into the modern, psychological and economic reasons why this decline has not only persisted but actually gotten worse in recent years.
Oh, yeah. It's a very complex cocktail of societal pressures right now. You have the housing crisis, which is just a massive physical barrier. Young people in their 20s and 30s simply cannot acquire the square footage required to comfortably start a family.
I mean, they can barely get a studio apartment, let alone a 3-bedroom house.
Right. But beyond the pure economics of it, there is this pervasive psychological barrier fueled by global anxiety. Fears about geopolitical instability, economic stagnation, and crucially, climate change.
Okay, the climate anxiety piece is wild to me because it feeds into this highly specific cultural phenomenon that the Dutch data identifies as baby shamte, or baby shame.
Yeah, baby shamte. It's a term that just perfectly encapsulates the modern zeitgeist.
What exactly does it mean in practice?
It describes a growing sentiment, particularly prevalent among highly educated urban demographics, that bringing a child into a world they view as, overpopulated, polluted, and ecologically doomed is fundamentally a moral failing.
A moral failing, wow.
Yeah, it completely inverts the historical view of reproduction. Not having children is transformed from a personal lifestyle preference into a virtuous, ethical stance.
Wait, I want to play devil's advocate here for a second, though. I want to push back on this framework.
Go for it.
Because if you listen to environmental advocates over the last, 40 years, a shrinking human footprint is exactly what they've been asking for.
Sure.
Less consumption, fewer cars on the road, less strain on agricultural resources. So why does a demographer like Latten, or really any macroeconomist for that matter, look at a declining population and immediately label it a crisis?
It's a totally understandable question. But looking at humans merely as carbon footprints ignores the interdependent reality of how a modern state actually functions. A society is a highly complex biological and economic ecosystem. When a population halves in a few generations, you don't just get a greener planet, you get an inverted demographic pyramid.
What does that mean for the average person?
It means you end up with a massive aging population that requires unprecedented levels of medical care, physical assistance, and pension payouts. And all of that immense financial and physical weight is balanced on the shoulders of a tiny, shrinking base of young, working-age people.
So the math of the welfare state just breaks down.
It shatters. You just don't have enough taxpayers to support the elderly.
The best way to visualize demographic momentum is to imagine this massive container ship out on the ocean. You can't just slam on the brakes or yank the steering wheel and expect it to turn immediately.
Great analogy.
Right. By the time the captain on the bridge realizes they're heading straight for a reef, by the time the economic burden of the elderly actually starts crushing the young taxpayers, it is way too late to alter course. The ship is already turning, imperceptibly slowly, toward disaster.
Exactly, because you cannot suddenly generate a 25-year-old nurse or a construction worker overnight.
No. It takes exactly 25 years to make one.
And Latten grounds this entire concept in a really sobering historical parallel to show that this isn't, a uniquely modern problem. He references the work of Oswald Spengler.
Oh, from The Decline of the West.
Yes. Spengler analyzed the life cycles of great civilizations and argued that hyperurbanization inevitably leads to what he called the sterility of the stone colossus.
The sterility of the stone colossus. Wow. That is a deeply haunting phrase.
It captures the historical rhythm perfectly, though. As societies become highly advanced, highly urbanized, and heavily focused on individual, intellectual, and economic pursuits, they literally stop reproducing.
We've seen this before.
Yes.
Yeah.
Latten points out that in ancient Rome, during the reign of the Emperor Augustus, the state was so panicked by the plummeting birth rates among the Roman patrician class, the educated elite, that Augustus actually had to pass specific legislation.
Wait, really? To make them have kids?
Yeah, the Lex Papia Poppaea. It was designed to financially incentivize marriage and heavily penalize childlessness. So this is a recurring cycle in the history of human civilization. We pour all our energy into building the stone colossus, and in the process, we forget to have the children required to maintain it.
But all that human energy has to go somewhere, right? If millions of people are opting out of building a traditional family structure, and they're redirecting that biological and emotional capital inward, what exactly does that look like?
Well, this brings us to a massive shift in the landscape of modern relationships. The data shows we are rapidly entering the era of the me society.
The me society. In Dutch sociological terms, the living. Right.
Exactly. It represents a profound structural shift away from collectivism and familial obligation, moving toward hyper-individualism. And the statistics Latten highlights here are, frankly, incredible.
Hit me with them.
If you look at a major urban center like Amsterdam today, roughly 2 out of every 3 households are single-person households.
2 out of 3. Just think about the physical reality of that. You walk down a hallway in an Amsterdam apartment building. You pass 3 doors, and behind 2 of them, there's just one person living entirely alone.
It's wild, but human beings are still inherently social creatures, right? Nature abhors an emotional vacuum. So because people are lacking traditional partners, spouses, and children, they're finding highly novel ways to fill that emotional space.
Which brings us to the pets.
Yes. One of the most visible demographic trends linked to this is the intense domestication and really the humanization of pets.
Oh, for sure. The pet industry isn't just growing, its fundamental nature is changing. I mean, dogs and cats are literally replacing children in the emotional hierarchy of these single households.
They absolutely are. They sleep in the beds. They require specialized organic diets. They receive high-level psychiatric and medical care.
Doggy daycare, doggy therapists.
Exactly. They are absorbing the psychological bandwidth that a family unit used to occupy.
And it extends way beyond pets, too. Because these individuals don't have a spouse to talk to at the end of a stressful workday, to, share the mental load of life or to bounce ideas off of, Latten observes this massive trend toward the professionalization of intimacy.
Oh, that's a perfect phrase for it.
Right. You outsource the emotional and physical support that a traditional community or marriage used to provide to this whole army of gig economy professionals.
You hire a mental coach to deal with your career anxiety. You hire a personal trainer for your physical accountability. You hire a therapist to unpack your family trauma.
You're essentially commodifying the support structures of human connection.
Hmm.
You are paying a premium to have a support network.
But even professional paid help has inherent friction, right?
Sure.
You have to make an appointment. You have to commute to an office. You have to deal with another human being's schedule, their moods, their limitations. Which brings the data to perhaps the most startling statistic regarding how the youngest generation is navigating this landscape.
Here is where it gets really interesting and honestly a little dystopian. The data indicates that currently 1 in 4 young people trust AI chatbots more than human beings when it comes to discussing their deep personal problems.
1 in 4, let that sink in.
1 in 4.
It represents a phenomenal, almost unprecedented shift in where humans place their trust. Latten refers to artificial intelligence as the new proletarian psychiatrist.
The proletarian psychiatrist.
Right. If you cannot afford a human therapist at $200 an hour, or if you simply don't want the vulnerability, the judgment, and the friction that comes with opening up to a flawed human partner, you just boot up a chatbot on your phone.
It's always awake.
Always awake, it has infinite patience, and its primary directive is to validate your feelings.
Latten explicitly references the 2013 sci-fi movie Her in the source material, where Joaquin Phoenix falls in love with his AI operating system.
Oh.
I remember watching that a decade ago and thinking it was a brilliant thought experiment, but, completely detached from reality. Now, Latten is stating that it is actively becoming demographic reality.
It's already here.
He quotes an anecdote about a young Chinese woman who relies heavily on an AI companion, and her reasoning just strips away all the romance.
Yeah.
She simply states that she prefers the chatbot because, quote, it only says nice things, and otherwise I just turn it off.
I just turn it off. I mean, that single sentence is the defining ethos of the me society.
It really is.
It is the absolute, uncompromising prioritization of personal convenience and the complete elimination of interpersonal friction. A real human relationship requires constant compromise, right?
Yeah, it requires dealing with someone else's bad moods, their physical flaws, their demands on your free time.
And an AI requires absolutely none of that.
It's as if we've turned the fundamental human experience into an a la carte subscription service.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Like you want the feeling of nurturing a dependent being. Get a dog. You want emotional validation without the risk of judgment. Subscribe to an AI companion. You want someone to push you physically. Hire a trainer. We've basically taken the messy, complicated, all-encompassing package of the traditional family, unbundled it, and turned it into a series of frictionless consumer services that we can cancel the second we feel inconvenienced.
It is a profound unbundling of society. However, the data makes it very clear that this isn't happening uniformly across the entire population.
Okay, so who's the exception here?
Well, while the single-person household dominates the urban landscape, there's a massive countertrend happening simultaneously among the demographic that does still choose to pair up.
Right.
And the specific way they are choosing to pair up is tearing the social fabric in a completely different direction.
Okay, let's look at the people who are thriving in the me society. This brings us to the demographic phenomenon of leaf-death selectee, or partner selection, and the creation of these really impenetrable urban bubbles.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, sociologists typically refer to this mechanism as assortative mating.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, if you look back a few generations, partner selection was often geographically bound, right? Or tied to a local church or a community center. There was a fair amount of cross-pollination across economic and educational classes. The factory manager might marry the local school teacher or the mechanic.
Right, there was mingling.
Today, people are increasingly and almost exclusively dating and marrying within their own highly specific socioeconomic and educational strata.
It's the old adage that, attracts, but it feels weaponized by modern geography and dating apps.
Highly weaponized.
Because highly educated, highly ambitious, career-driven individuals are flocking to specific major cities, places like Utrecht or Amsterdam or London. They attend the same elite universities, they filter for the exact same educational credentials on their dating apps, they work in the same corporate sectors, and inevitably, they find each other.
And they form these massive power couples.
Right. And when two high-earning individuals merge their lives, they don't just double their income. They exponentially increase their wealth-building capacity, their social capital, and their cultural influence over decades.
Exactly. And the demographic data tracks a very clear divergence here. Women who perhaps have university degrees but are less intensely focused on climbing the corporate ladder often exhibit a completely different migratory pattern.
Where do they go?
After finishing their studies in the city, they are far more likely to move back to rural or semi-rural provinces. They focus on starting a family, engaging in local community life, and leaning into a quieter existence. Latten paints this picture of this demographic tending a morstuin, a vegetable garden, far away from the corporate grind.
So the physical map of the country actually begins to reflect this division.
Yes.
You have the power couples hyper-concentrating in specific, expensive city centers, and the more family-oriented, slightly more traditional couples dispersing to the rural provinces.
And when you look at the mechanisms driving this, the implications for societal inequality are just immense. I mean, we constantly hear politicians giving speeches lamenting the gap in society, right?
Always.
The growing chasm between the wealthy elite and the working class, or the highly educated and the uneducated, they almost always frame it as a failure of economic policy or tax structures or unequal funding in the education system.
But Latten argues they're missing the point.
Completely. Observing this through the lens of social demography, he argues that we are the ones creating the gap, actively and voluntarily, in our own bedrooms, through whom we choose to swipe right on and marry.
The irony there is so incredibly thick.
Right.
I mean, we live in a cultural era that is absolutely obsessed with the concept of equity and fighting systemic inequality. It dominates the cultural discourse. Yet our most intimate personal choices, our relationship choices, are the very engines hypercharging that exact same inequality.
Because it creates a self-replicating cycle of structural advantage that literally no government tax policy can effectively dismantle. These power couples concentrate in very specific, highly affluent zip codes. They drive up real estate prices, which locks everyone else out.
Yeah.
Latten points out that you can essentially predict the educational future of a region purely by looking at a real estate map.
Really? Just from the zip code?
Yes, you can predict exactly where the highest performing high school students, those qualifying for the elite VWO track in the Dutch system, for example, will come from. It ceases to be just a matter of economic inequality. It morphs into genetic and cultural segregation by zip code.
Because the children of these power couples inherit not just financial wealth, but this intense culture of high achievement.
Exactly. A curated social network, a perfectly optimized home environment. They are effectively shutting the door behind them.
Let's take a beat and synthesize what we've mapped out so far, because we've built a very specific, data-driven profile of the native population here. We've established that their birth rate has mathematically collapsed. We've established that their urban centers are dominated by singles who are outsourcing human intimacy to pets and AI.
Right.
And we've established that the minority who do pair up are self-segregating into hyper-elite, walled-off urban bubbles. So if all of that is empirically true, if the native population is simultaneously shrinking and atomizing, then how exactly did a country like the Netherlands grow its population by 1 million people over the last decade?
And that question flips the demographic coin entirely over because the growth of the population is entirely 100% driven by immigration. The natural population, meaning those without a recent migration background, is currently in a state of outright contraction.
Now, this is an area where the data demands intense nuance, because the demographics of this population growth are not a monolith. The statistics break down exactly who is arriving, and they behave very differently.
Broadly speaking, you really have to separate the streams here. You have labor migrants, for instance, who often arrive from Eastern Europe, places like Poland or Romania.
Right.
Demographically, labor migration is highly fluid. Individuals often come to work in agriculture or logistics for a few years, earn money, and then return to their home countries or move to another European nation.
So they don't stay forever.
Generally, no. They undoubtedly contribute heavily to the immediate economy, but their long-term demographic footprint is relatively light because of that high mobility. They don't usually put down permanent roots.
But then you look at asylum migration, and crucially, the associated mechanism of family reunification, what the Dutch refer to as neerziekers. And the mathematical behavior of this group is entirely different.
Completely different. While asylum migrants might only represent a smaller fraction of the total incoming border crossings in any single given year, perhaps 10%, their stay rate is phenomenally high.
So once they're in, they stay.
Once they navigate the asylum process and arrive, they rarely leave. Therefore, if you look at the cumulative effect over a 10-year period, that 10% compounds massively.
Wow.
Latten calculates that of the 1 million people added to the Dutch population recently, up to 30% of that permanent growth is driven directly by asylum migration and their reunified family members.
Which brings us back to the core premise of social demography, right? Counting the people arriving is only step one. The vital question is what happens after they arrive.
Exactly.
How do they integrate into this highly complex, highly specialized, hyper-individualistic moo society we just spent half an hour describing? And the data here highlights some massive structural frictions. The analysis notes that 30 to 40% of asylum migrants are still not participating in the labor market, even after residing in the country for 10 full years. Now, I have to pause and dig into that statistic, because on the surface, that feels contradictory to what we hear. We constantly hear about massive labor shortages across Europe. Every restaurant, every construction company needs workers. How is it mathematically possible that nearly 40% of this demographic isn't working after a decade? What is the actual friction happening on the ground?
It's a collision. It is a collision between the skills of the arriving population and the hyper-specialized nature of a top-tier Western economy.
Okay, unpack that for me.
You're taking individuals who often come from agrarian or informal economies, who frequently lack recognized formal educational credentials, and who face a massive language barrier. And you're dropping them into a society where almost every entry-level job now requires digital literacy, specific certifications, and fluent communication skills.
You can't just walk onto a job site anymore.
Exactly. Add to that the deeply ingrained trauma many experienced while fleeing conflict zones, and the labyrinthine bureaucratic systems they have to navigate just to get a permit to work. You create a massive structural bottleneck. The economy demands a very specific type of worker, and the incoming population often does not match that profile.
And understanding that friction is crucial, because Latten issues a very stark warning in the source material about how the government is actively choosing to measure this integration over time. He points to a statistical sleight of hand occurring within government agencies.
This raises an important question about how we define reality. The government is currently in the process of altering the fundamental statistical definition of who is considered a native or autochtone.
How are they changing it?
Under the new frameworks being implemented, by the time a family line reaches the third generation, meaning the individual is the child of a second-generation immigrant born in the Netherlands, they are simply swallowed up by the statistics.
Meaning what, exactly?
They are classified purely as native. Their entire migration background is statistically erased from the government's tracking data.
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second.
Yeah.
Because from a certain perspective, that policy sounds progressive and completely reasonable.
Sure, I can see that.
Isn't it fair to assume that by the third generation, like, your grandparents arrived, your parents were born and raised here, you were born here, that you were fully assimilated into the host culture? You speak the language natively, you went through the local school system. Why does the statistical label even matter at that point? Why not just consider everyone a native citizen?
Because assuming that deep cultural assimilation automatically happens purely based on the passage of time on a calendar is a massive, historically disproven blind spot.
Historically disproven.
Yes. Latin uses a very specific, tragic historical example from the source to prove why the statistical erasure is so dangerous. In the 1970s, the Dutch government looked at the Moluccan immigrant community.
Okay, just for some context for you listening, these were soldiers from the Dutch East Indies who fought for the Dutch, were brought to the Netherlands temporarily after Indonesia gained independence, but ended up staying permanently, often marginalized in camps.
Exactly. Fast forward a few decades, and the government, looking at their internal data, essentially assumed that the third generation of Moluccans was fully integrated into the broader Dutch society.
They assumed time healed everything.
They assumed the math of time equaled the reality of culture, but sociological research later proved that assumption was entirely false. That third generation didn't feel assimilated at all. They felt deeply alienated, disenfranchised, and entirely disconnected from the mainstream culture.
Because they were just living in a completely different reality than the native Dutch.
Right. But because the statistics had essentially painted over this reality, the government was flying completely blind. They missed the rising anger, which ultimately culminated in a series of highly traumatic, violent train hijackings by radicalized Moluccan youth in the late 1970s.
Oh, wow.
Latten's underlying point is this. If statistics redefine reality to the point where we can no longer track the cultural, religious, and social changes of incoming groups over time, then the statistics cease to be a diagnostic tool.
They become useless.
They become useless, or worse, they become a form of political propaganda designed to hide a failure of integration.
If you alter the definition so you literally cannot see the problem in the data, the problem doesn't vanish. You just lose all ability to solve it. Which means if we cannot blindly assume that assimilation just magically occurs by the third generation, we have to look very, very closely at what values these new permanent populations are actually bringing with them and how those values interact with the society they're entering. Now, before we move into this next phase of the data, it's really worth pausing to state our role here very clearly.
Yes, absolutely.
We are unpacking highly debated demographic and cultural shifts. As your hosts, we want to make it explicitly clear to you that we are not taking a side. We are not here to validate one lifestyle, one religion, or one cultural framework over another.
The data doesn't judge.
Exactly. Our job today is strictly to impartially report on the numbers and the sociological analysis provided by Jan Latten in the source material so that you can clearly see the forces actively reshaping the world around you.
And the clearest, most data-driven way to visualize these competing forces is through an incredible piece of sociological research known as the World Value Survey.
Oh, this chart is fascinating.
It is. The World Value Survey is a massive global polling project that literally maps the cultural values of nations on a giant X and Y axis. It cuts through the noise and tells you exactly what different cultures fundamentally prioritize in life.
Okay, walk us through this map. Where does a country like the Netherlands or broader Western Europe sit on these axes?
So Protestant Northwest Europe countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark sit at the absolute extreme top right corner of this chart.
Okay, top right.
This quadrant represents societies that score incredibly high on two metrics. They are highly secular and they prioritize high self-expression.
High secularism and high self-expression. I mean, this is the
Yeah.
cultural epicenter of the V society we unpacked earlier, right?
Exactly.
This is a culture whose foundational motto is, I am the master of my own destiny, I choose my own life, I define my own truth. It's the culture of atheism, of coloring your hair blue, of absolute individual freedom, where the ultimate societal goal is maximizing personal happiness.
It is the absolute pinnacle of expressive individualism. Now, take your finger and trace it all the way across the map to the opposite extreme.
Okay.
Look at the bottom left corner. This quadrant represents societies that are highly traditional, highly collectivist, and survival-oriented. And critically, for our demographic discussion, this is the quadrant that contains the primary origin countries of recent asylum migrants, nations like Afghanistan, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Palestine.
So what are the defining characteristics of that bottom left quadrant? Like, how do they view the world compared to the top right?
In these societies, life is not viewed as a canvas for self-expression or choosing your own unique path. Life is dictated by a strict, unwavering adherence to holy texts, to the preservation of family and tribal honor, to deep-rooted community obligations, and to strict, non-negotiable rules of behavior regarding gender and social roles.
Duty to the collective.
Exactly. Duty to the collective completely overrides the desires or whims of the individual.
Let's bring this abstract chart down to a street-level reality to see how this friction actually manifests.
Yeah.
Because I think this is where the source material gets really eliminating. Imagine you live in a social housing complex in a major European city, okay? You've grown up firmly planted in the top right quadrant. You have your hyper-individualistic worldview. You firmly believe religion is an archaic fairy tale holding humanity back, and your entire moral compass is calibrated around maximizing personal freedom and dismantling traditional norms.
Now imagine your new neighbor moves into the apartment across the hall. They have just arrived from the extreme bottom left quadrant of the World Values Survey. They believe in strict religious modesty. They believe that women should swim fully clothed to preserve their honor. They believe in absolute, unquestioning obedience to a religious text. And they view your hyper-individualistic secular lifestyle not as liberating freedom, but as chaotic, deeply immoral, and fundamentally corrupt.
You literally have two diametrically opposed operating systems trying to share the same hallway, the same grocery store, the same school district.
Yes.
And this highlights what Latten identifies as the massive, almost fatal blind spot of the secular West. The host society, the top right quadrant, is so arrogant in its belief that its way of life is the ultimate, final pinnacle of human evolution that it simply assumes everyone in the world secretly wants to be a hyper-individualist.
It is a profound cultural narcissism. The Western progressive looks at the migrant and instinctively thinks, oh, you fled your war-torn country to come here because you crave our exact brand of freedom. You want to be just like us. You want our woke mentality, our gender theories, and our secular liberties. But the hard data from the World Value Survey suggests that assumption is frequently entirely false.
Because migrants often undertake these incredibly dangerous journeys for purely economic reasons, right? Or to escape imminent physical danger and violence.
Absolutely. They come for physical safety, for economic resources, for a functioning infrastructure. They do not necessarily come because they want to abandon their deeply held traditional values and suddenly adopt a secular, blue-haired lifestyle. And the analysis uses a very potent, highly visible symbol to illustrate this total disconnect.
The headscarf.
A headscarf. When a secular, top-right Westerner looks at a young woman wearing a headscarf, they instinctively apply their own cultural lens of self-expression. They think, oh, that is her personal choice. It's an empowering fashion statement. It's her unique way of expressing her individual identity against the patriarchy.
Right, because in the top right quadrant, literally everything is viewed as a fashion statement or a personal brand. We just project that onto everyone else.
Exactly. But Latten, speaking as a demographer, observing how Orthodox communities actually function, notes that within the context of the bottom left quadrant, the headscarf is rarely a mere fashion choice.
What is it then?
It is a package deal. It represents adherence to a very specific patriarchal family structure. It signifies obedience to a husband, a father, or a religious authority. And crucially, in a chaotic, diverse urban environment, it acts as a highly visible flag of self-segregation.
A flag of self-segregation.
Yes. It's a mechanism for a young woman to signal to the secular youth around her, I am not a part of your culture, I do not play by your rules, and I am not a potential partner for you. Do not approach me. It fiercely enforces the boundary between the two quadrants.
So what does this all mean? It means we are projecting our own cultural obsession with choice onto a population that genuinely finds its ultimate meaning, its safety, and its identity in the concept of duty. And when you mistake a profound religious duty for a quirky lifestyle choice, you fundamentally misunderstand the people you are sharing a society with. Now, this clash of values, this slow-motion collision between the top right and the bottom left of the chart, isn't just playing out in academic debates or government policy papers. It is actively playing out in real time, right now, in the minds of the youngest generations.
Yes, and this brings us to the final and perhaps most deeply surprising data point in Latten's analysis.
I'll break it down for us.
When demographers look at the youth cohorts today, there is a shocking twist in the data regarding religious affiliation. For the last 70 years, the baseline assumption of Western sociology was that each successive generation would naturally be less religious than the last.
Right, the march of progress.
Exactly. But the current data shows that the 15 to 18-year-old demographic is actually more religious than the 18 to 25-year-old demographic. The long trend line of secularization has suddenly violently hooked backward.
Let's break down where that religious resurgence is actually coming from. Because it's happening on two fronts, right?
It is.
On one side, driven significantly by the demographic and migration shifts we just discussed, roughly 1 in 6 youths in these urban areas now identify as Islamic. But it's not exclusively driven by migration. Simultaneously, there is a highly visible, growing return to conservative evangelical Christianity among native university-educated students. The native youth, the ones raised in the secular top-right quadrant, are finding religion again, too.
And if we synthesize all the threads we've pulled throughout this deep dive, it makes perfect psychological sense why this is happening.
Really? How so?
Well, the me society that we built, the society of absolute, unbridled individual freedom, of single-person households, of outsourcing your deepest human intimacy to AI chatbots, feels, as Latten beautifully describes it, like loose sand.
Loose sand.
There is no bedrock. People are profoundly lonely. They are adrift in a sea of endless consumer choices. They are slowly, painfully realizing that absolute freedom from all social obligations also means an absolute lack of connection to anything larger than themselves.
It's the ultimate paradox of choice. You can do anything you want, sleep with anyone you want, be anyone you want, but none of it feels meaningful because there are no stakes.
Right.
And this exposes the total catastrophic failure of what the Dutch refer to as itsesis, or somethingism.
Somethingism. It really was the ultimate spiritual compromise of the late 20th century.
It's hilarious, but also deeply bleak when you think about it. Somethingism is the idea that, well, I believe there must be something out there, maybe a benevolent energy or a vague higher power looking down on us, but I absolutely refuse to let that something tell me what to do on a Tuesday night.
Exactly.
It is wanting all the psychological comfort of a guardian angel, but flat out refusing to accept any of the rules, the rituals, or the community obligations that come with actual organized religion.
And what we are seeing in the data is that the youth are aggressively rejecting this wishy-washy buffet-style spirituality. When you feel like you are drowning in the loose sand of the moose society, a vague sense of something doesn't save you.
Yeah.
You don't need a vibe. You need a solid rock. So they are gravitating toward rigid, orthodox, highly structured belief systems, whether that is conservative Islam or traditional Christianity. Religion provides binding, non-negotiable rules. It provides a fierce, protective sense of community, and it provides absolute, unquestionable meaning. It tells you exactly who you are, what your purpose is, and what is expected of you.
So how does this ideological shift actually look on the ground, in the real world of an expanding city? Latten warns of a phenomenon he calls competing norms. This plays out most intensely in urban school districts, and specifically in vocational schools, where these different demographics are forced to mix on a daily basis.
Right. When you have two radically different value systems occupying the exact same physical space, and the demographic weight begins to shift away from the native majority, the fundamental question becomes, who actually gets to dictate the social rules?
Yeah, who wins?
The host society simply assumes its secular, top-right rules will remain the default forever. But the data shows rising, daily friction. Latten points to increasing conflicts in classrooms over fundamental issues. Biology teachers face intense, organized resistance when trying to teach Darwinian evolution because it directly conflicts with literalist religious texts.
And there is massive vocal pushback against the Linda Kriebel's lessons, right? Which are the standard state-mandated Dutch spring fever sex education classes. What was considered totally normal baseline secular education 10 years ago is now a massive flashpoint for cultural conflict.
You see it in the friction female teachers experience when trying to command authority over male students who have been raised in highly patriarchal, bottom-left backgrounds. You even see it boiling over into fierce geopolitical tribalism during something as seemingly trivial as a local soccer match, where complex Middle Eastern conflicts are violently reenacted on the streets of European cities by teenagers.
These aren't just isolated anecdotal incidents. They are the structural stress tests of competing norms.
What's fascinating here is what this means for our broader understanding of history. For the last 100 years, sociologists have essentially worshipped at the altar of the secularization thesis.
Right, the ironclad, unquestionable belief in academia that as human societies modernize, as they get richer, more educated, and more technologically advanced, they will inevitably and permanently shed their religion. It was considered a permanent one-way street towards secular atheism.
But Latten's analysis of the youth data suggests that the secularization thesis might be completely dead in the water.
Wait, really?
We may look back in 50 years and realize that we just lived through peak secularism, that the hyper-individualistic, atheistic era we are in right now wasn't the final enlightened destination of human evolution, but just a weird, temporary demographic blip before society returned to a more religious, tribal, and collectivist baseline.
What a journey this has been today. We started this deep dive by looking at a silent, invisible baby crisis, the mathematical reality of a native population quietly shrinking beneath the surface of our congested, gridlocked cities. We explored how the remnants of that population have atomized into a lonely me society, where singles are literally outsourcing their human intimacy to AI chatbots and pets.
Yeah.
And where the few who do pair up self-segregate into impenetrable, highly affluent urban bubbles.
And then we overlaid that domestic reality with the profound compounding impact of global immigration. We examined how changing statistical definitions obscure the real structural challenges of integration, and we confronted the stark, uncomfortable reality of the World Value Survey. The daily collision between a host culture built on ultimate individual self-expression and incoming populations rooted in traditional religious duty. A collision that is actively rewriting the cultural DNA of the youngest generations right in front of us.
As we wrap up, I want to reiterate our impartiality rule one last time to you listening. Social demography, as Jan Latten practices it, does not exist to judge these massive tectonic shifts as good or evil. The numbers don't have a moral compass, and neither do we. The goal is simply to count the people, track the evolving values, and force society to actually look at the reality it is operating in, rather than flying blind based on outdated academic assumptions and comfortable political illusions.
Which leaves us with a final, rather profound question to consider. A thought that builds on everything we've synthesized today. We built this modern Western society on the absolute, unquestionable right to choose.
The right to choose your partner, to choose your religion, to choose your gender identity, to choose your entire path in life.
Exactly. But demography is destiny. If these trend lines continue, if the people who prioritize choice and individualism literally stop having children, and the populations that prioritize religious duty and collectivism continue to grow and compound, the right to choose might eventually simply be outvoted.
Wow.
It might be democratically replaced by a growing population that finds its ultimate highest meaning in the duty to obey.
You really have to wonder, is hyper-individualism just a temporary demographic phase? A luxury of a specific, wealthy era that is currently quietly breeding itself out of existence? It is definitely something to think about the next time you walk down a crowded city street surrounded by thousands of people and wonder where society is actually heading. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and keep looking beneath the surface of the statistics.